The 13-year-old princess stood trembling behind the ornate doors of the bridal chamber, her fingers wrapped so tightly around the jeweled dagger hidden in her wedding dress that her knuckles had turned white. In just moments, those doors would open, and she would face a man she'd met only hours before, a 50-year-old military commander chosen by her grandmother not for love, but for political convenience. What happened next in that room would shock even the palace guards stationed outside, because Princess Kaya Sultan wasn't going to submit quietly to her fate. She was going to fight. In the next few minutes, you're about to discover the horrifying reality that Ottoman imperial daughters faced on their wedding nights, a truth so disturbing that palace chroniclers deliberately obscured it for centuries. This isn't just another story about arranged marriages. This is about young girls raised as untouchable royalty who were suddenly thrust into situations where they had to choose between dishonoring their family or surrendering their bodies to strangers old enough to be their grandfathers. And the evidence I am about to show you proves that some of these princesses were so terrified they literally said they'd rather die than face what awaited them in that marriage bed. But here is what makes this even more shocking. These weren't just any young women. They were daughters of the most powerful rulers on earth. Princesses who technically outranked every single person in the empire except their own fathers. They had rights that other women could only dream of, including the legal power to refuse their husbands and even divorce at will. Yet despite all that power, despite all that privilege, they still found themselves in situations so terrifying that one princess kept her husband at arm's length for 7 straight years, while another demanded a divorce on her wedding night itself. The Ottoman Empire, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, built its power on strategic marriages that were never about love and always about control. Every single Ottoman princess knew from childhood that her body would eventually become a tool of statecraft, a living treaty sealed not with wax, but with blood. The palace they grew up in, Topkapi, with its labyrinthine corridors and hidden passages, was both a paradise and a prison. Behind those walls, in the legendary harem, a word that literally means forbidden, these young girls lived lives of extraordinary luxury and crushing isolation. Picture a world where a princess might never see an unrelated man until the night she was expected to share a bed with one. The harem wasn't just segregated. It was a complete separation from the male world. These girls grew up surrounded entirely by women and eunuchs, castrated men who served as guards and intermediaries. Their own fathers, the sultans, were distant figures who might visit occasionally but remained fundamentally strangers. The only men these princesses knew with any familiarity were their brothers, and even those relationships were often strained by the brutal politics of succession. The education these princesses received prepared them for everything except what they feared most. They learned poetry, music, and calligraphy. They studied the management of vast households and the intricate etiquette of court life. They could speak multiple languages and command servants with imperial authority. But when it came to the physical realities of marriage, to the intimate act that would be expected of them, there was only silence punctuated by whispers. The older women in the harem might offer cryptic warnings or vague reassurances, but frank discussion of sexuality was considered deeply improper. These girls approached their wedding nights armed with fear and ignorance in equal measure. Now, you might think that being a princess would at least mean you'd have some say in who you married, but that's where the Ottoman system revealed its true cruelty. These marriages were orchestrated entirely by 2 people, the reigning sultan, and even more commonly, his mother, the Valide Sultan. The Queen Mother, as she was known, wielded enormous power during what historians call the Sultanate of Women, a period spanning the 16th and 17th centuries when the women of the imperial harem effectively controlled the empire from behind the scenes. Take the case of Kösem Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. She ruled as regent for multiple sultans and treated her daughters and granddaughters like chess pieces on a political board. When her favorite granddaughter Kaya begged not to marry Melik Ahmed Pasha, a man 40 years her senior, Kösem ignored her pleas entirely. The marriage would strengthen a crucial political alliance, and that was all that mattered. The fact that Kaya was barely 13 years old and terrified of her prospective husband was irrelevant to the calculation. The system of marriage for Ottoman princesses had evolved into something uniquely restrictive by the late 15th century. Earlier, sultans had occasionally married their daughters to foreign princes, creating international alliances. But as the empire grew more powerful, this practice stopped entirely. Why? Because the Ottomans feared that giving a princess to a foreign ruler might create future claims to the throne or split loyalties. Instead, they adopted what historians call an endogamous marriage policy. Princesses would marry either distant Ottoman cousins or, far more commonly, high-ranking servants of the Sultan. Think about what that meant. These weren't marriages between equals. The grooms were typically viziers, pashas, or military commanders who had risen through the ranks of the devshirme system, the practice of taking Christian boys as slaves, converting them to Islam, and training them to serve the empire. These men owed everything to the Sultan. Marrying them to a princess bound them even more tightly to the dynasty while ensuring they could never become independent powers. The princess, despite her royal blood, was essentially being given to a slave, albeit an incredibly powerful and wealthy one. But here's where it gets even more complex. Ottoman princesses did have certain unique privileges written into their marriage contracts. Unlike any other woman in the empire, a princess had the right to be her husband's only wife. That's right. While Islamic law allowed men up to 4 wives, any man who married an Ottoman princess was contractually forbidden from taking another. She also had the right to initiate divorce at will, something unheard of for ordinary women. And perhaps most remarkably, she had the legal right to refuse consummation until she felt ready. You'd think these protections would ease their fears, but in reality, they often made things worse. Because while a princess could technically refuse her husband, the pressure to eventually submit was overwhelming. The entire purpose of the marriage was political, and an unconsummated marriage served no one's interests. The princess's own family, the very people who should have protected her, would eventually force her to fulfill her duty. The age disparities in these marriages were stomach-churning by any standard. It wasn't unusual for a 12 or 13-year-old princess to be married to a man in his 50s or 60s. In one particularly disturbing case, Princess Fatma Sultan was married 7 times over the course of her life, starting when she was just a child. By her final marriage, she was in her late 50s and her husband was in his 70s. The same Melik Ahmed Pasha, who had previously been married to her young niece Kaya. The fact that this man had been passed around the family like a political party favor shows just how little personal feelings mattered in these arrangements. Now, most of what happened behind the closed doors of the bridal chamber was deliberately kept secret. The Ottoman court operated on a principle of total discretion when it came to the intimate lives of royal women. But occasionally, when things went catastrophically wrong, the truth leaked out. And that's how we know about what happened on Kaya Sultan's wedding night in 1644. Picture the scene. The wedding festivities had lasted for days. The entire city of Istanbul had celebrated as the young princess was paraded through the streets in a golden carriage, hidden behind veils from public view. Thousands of coins were thrown to the crowds, and the palace hosted feast after feast. But Kaya herself was miserable. She had begged her mother and grandmother not to force this marriage. She had even dared to express interest in another man, an almost unthinkable breach of protocol. All her protests had been ignored. When the celebration finally ended and the guests departed, Kaya was led to the bridal chamber where Melik Ahmed Pasha waited. What happened next was recorded by Evliya Çelebi, the famous Ottoman traveler who knew the princess personally. As the Pasha approached his young bride, expecting her to submit as was customary, Kaya pulled out the dagger she had hidden in her clothing. She didn't just threaten him. She actually struck him with it, drawing blood and forcing him to retreat from the room. Think about the courage that took. Here was a 13-year-old girl, raised in absolute submission to authority, who chose physical violence rather than submit to a man she didn't want. The guards outside must have heard the commotion, but they didn't dare intervene. After all, she was the Sultan's daughter, and her husband was just a servant, however elevated. Melik Ahmed Pasha, wounded and humiliated, had no choice but to accept his wife's rejection. As Evliya Çelebi wrote, he accepted this because he could do nothing else by virtue of his wife's higher rank. But Kaya's resistance didn't end that night. She invoked her right as an imperial princess to refuse consummation indefinitely. For 7 years, she kept Melik Ahmed at arm's length, refusing to share his bed, refusing to make the marriage real in any physical sense. During this time, they lived as strangers in the same household, a mockery of marriage that must have been the subject of endless palace gossip. What finally broke Kaya's resistance? It wasn't love or even resignation. It was pressure from her grandmother, Kösem Sultan, who eventually ordered her to fulfill her marital duties. The political alliance needed to be cemented with children, and Kösem had run out of patience with her granddaughter's defiance. Even then, Kaya only agreed after extracting promises and concessions from her husband. The man who had once tried to claim her by right now had to win her over through negotiation. Incredibly, once Kaya finally accepted her situation, the marriage transformed into something approaching genuine affection. Evliya Çelebi, who knew them both, wrote that none got on with her husband so well as Kaya did. She became not just his wife, but his political advisor, wielding influence through him at court. But the story doesn't have a happy ending. Remember that prophecy Kaya feared, that if she bore a daughter, she would die? That fear, which had partly motivated her 7-year resistance, proved tragically accurate. In 1659, at just 26 years old, Kaya Sultan died from complications in childbirth after delivering a daughter. Her story illuminates the impossible position these princesses occupied. They had just enough power to resist, but not enough to truly choose their own fates. They could delay the inevitable, but never escape it entirely. And the psychological toll of this half-power, half-powerlessness was devastating. But not all princesses responded to their wedding night fears with violence. Some, particularly older princesses who had been married multiple times, developed different strategies. Take Princess Fatma Sultan, whom I mentioned earlier. By the time of her 7th and final marriage, she had been widowed 6 times, several of her husbands executed on orders of her own relatives. She had seen how disposable these political marriages were, how quickly a valued alliance could turn into a death sentence. When Fatma was forced to marry Melik Ahmed Pasha in 1662, after he had been widowed by her niece Kaya's death, she was in her late 50s and had no illusions about romance. The marriage had been forced on both of them by the Grand Vizier as a form of political punishment. Neither wanted it. So, on their wedding night, instead of violence or tears, Fatma chose negotiation. She presented Melik Ahmed with a list of financial demands so outrageous that he initially refused to accept them. She wanted an allowance equivalent to the annual tax revenue of Egypt, the richest province in the empire. When the elderly Pasha protested that such a sum was impossible, Fatma's response was ice cold. Pay up or agree to an immediate divorce and return her entire dowry at once. That dowry, by the way, was also worth approximately 1 year of Egypt's tax revenues. She had him trapped. If he divorced her, he'd be financially ruined and politically humiliated. If he stayed married, he'd be financially drained, but maintain his position. The wedding night that should have been about physical consummation became instead a brutal financial negotiation, with Fatma using the only power she had, her wealth and status, to maintain control over her own life. The marriage lasted only a few months before Melik Ahmed died, possibly, as one chronicler dryly noted, from stress. Fatma immediately seized his properties before the authorities could intervene, claiming them as compensation for her unpaid allowances. It took the personal intervention of the Grand Vizier to force her to return some of the estates. Even in his death, she was extracting value from a marriage she never wanted. These documented cases represent just the tip of the iceberg. For every Kaya who fought back with a dagger, or every Fatma who turned her wedding night into a business negotiation, there were dozens of princesses whose fears and resistance went unrecorded. The Ottoman court's culture of secrecy meant that most of what happened in those bridal chambers stayed hidden. We only know about the exceptions. The case is so dramatic they couldn't be completely suppressed. But even the silence tells us something. The fact that the court worked so hard to hide these stories, that chroniclers wrote in euphemisms and half-truths, suggests that resistance was more common than the official histories would have us believe. When Evliya Çelebi wrote about Kaya, he called her a raging lioness, which sounds like praise, but might also have been code for behavior that was more common than anyone wanted to admit. Consider the physical reality these young women faced. Most had been raised in such seclusion that they had never been alone with a man. They had been taught that modesty and chastity were their highest virtues. Then, in a single night, they were expected to transition from untouchable virgin to willing wife. The psychological whiplash must have been devastating. Everything they had been taught about protecting their virtue was suddenly reversed. The same body that had been hidden behind veils and walls was now expected to be surrendered to a stranger. The medical realities added another layer of terror. These princesses knew that pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous. They had grown up in palaces where women regularly died in childbirth or from pregnancy complications. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Even with the best medical care available, many royal babies died within their first year. A princess approaching her wedding night was not just facing the loss of her virginity, she was facing the very real possibility of death. Ottoman medical texts from the period reveal that palace physicians were sometimes called to treat young brides for what they delicately termed wedding night injuries. The combination of youth, fear, and force could result in physical trauma that required medical intervention. These injuries were never officially recorded as being connected to resistance or assault. They were simply noted as requiring treatment. Another secret buried in the palace archives. The role of the eunuchs in these scenarios was particularly complex. These castrated men, who served as guardians and intermediaries in the harem, were often the only safe males the princesses knew. Some princesses formed deep emotional bonds with their eunuch guards, relationships that occupied a strange space between friendship and something more complex, a kind of romantic attachment that could never be physically consummated. There are accounts of princesses begging their favorite eunuchs to help them escape their wedding nights, to find some excuse or delay. But the eunuchs, despite their sympathy, were ultimately servants of the sultan. They could offer comfort, but not real assistance. One chronicler describes a eunuch holding a sobbing princess before her wedding, telling her to be brave, while knowing he was powerless to protect her from what was coming. The preparation rituals for the wedding night were themselves a form of psychological torture. The bride would be bathed and perfumed by servants, her body hair removed according to Islamic custom, her skin softened with oils and creams. Every inch of her would be prepared for her husband's pleasure, while she sat passive, being transformed into an object of desire against her will. The beautiful clothes and jewels she wore were like elaborate gift wrapping on a present she didn't want to give. Some princesses reportedly tried to make themselves less attractive, hoping to repel their husbands. They would refuse beauty treatments or try to hide physical flaws that might make them less desirable. But these small acts of rebellion were usually futile. The marriage wasn't about attraction, it was about politics and duty. The husband would do what was expected regardless of his bride's appearance or demeanor. The morning after the wedding night brought its own horrors. There were traditions, varying by period and palace custom, of displaying evidence of consummation. While we don't have explicit records of bloodied sheets being shown in the Ottoman palace, we do know that senior women of the harem would discreetly verify that the marriage had been consummated. For a terrified young princess, the knowledge that her most intimate trauma would be inspected and confirmed must have added another layer of humiliation to an already unbearable situation. But here is something that makes these stories even more tragic. Many of these princesses were married multiple times while still children. The turnover of husbands due to political executions, deaths in battle, or simple changes in alliances meant that a princess might face multiple wedding nights before she even reached full physical maturity. Princess Fatma's 7 marriages meant 7 wedding nights, 7 different men she was expected to submit to, 7 times she had to navigate the dangerous waters between duty and self-preservation. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the wedding night itself. These princesses lived their entire lives knowing that their bodies were not their own, that at any moment they could be married off to serve the dynasty's interests. Even those who eventually found happiness in their marriages, and some did, never forgot the terror of those early days. The trauma shaped how they raised their own daughters, how they navigated court politics, and how they understood their place in the world. The few princesses who managed to avoid marriage altogether did so only through extraordinary circumstances. Some took religious vows, becoming devoted to charity and prayer in a way that made marriage seem inappropriate. Others developed mysterious illnesses that made them unsuitable brides. A few managed to stay single by becoming indispensable to the reigning sultan or valide sultan in other ways, serving as political advisors or household managers whose value unmarried exceeded their worth as marriage pawns. But these were exceptions. The vast majority of Ottoman princesses faced that dreaded wedding night, and the fear they felt was entirely rational. They weren't being dramatic or overly sensitive. They were young girls facing a genuinely traumatic situation with no real power to prevent it. The fact that some fought back, that some found ways to resist or negotiate, speaks to incredible courage in the face of systematic oppression. The Ottoman Empire justified this system through a combination of religious interpretation, political necessity, and cultural tradition. Islamic law, as interpreted by Ottoman scholars, gave fathers absolute authority over their daughters' marriages. The political structure of the empire demanded that alliances be sealed through marriage, and centuries of tradition had normalized what was, in essence, a form of sanctioned sexual coercion. The princesses themselves were caught between different forms of power. They had the power of rank. They were imperial blood, superior to everyone except the sultan himself. They had the power of wealth. Their dowries and allowances were staggering. They had certain legal powers, the right to refuse other wives, to initiate divorce. But they lacked the most fundamental power of all, the right to say no to marriage itself, the right to choose their own partners, the right to control their own bodies. This paradox created a unique form of psychological torture. They were simultaneously powerful and powerless, protected and vulnerable, honored and exploited. The cognitive dissonance of their position, being told they were precious and valuable while being traded like property, must have been mentally devastating. No wonder some princesses reportedly went mad, developing what court physicians called melancholia, but what we might recognize today as severe depression or PTSD. The international observers who occasionally gained access to the Ottoman court often noted the strange atmosphere surrounding royal marriages. European ambassadors wrote back to their home courts about the lavish celebrations that seemed to mask an underlying tension. One Venetian ambassador noted that during a princess's wedding procession, despite the music and celebration, the palace women watching from behind screened windows seemed to be in mourning rather than celebration. These observations from outsiders are valuable because they weren't bound by the same conventions of silence as Ottoman chroniclers. They could write what they saw more freely, and what they saw was a system that traumatized its most privileged women. When Kaya Sultan brandished that dagger on her wedding night, she wasn't just fighting off an unwanted husband. She was fighting for the right to remain human in a system designed to turn princesses into breathing treaties. The fact that she held out for 7 years before finally surrendering makes her story not one of eventual happiness, but of tragedy. Because even the strongest resistance eventually breaks against the weight of empire. These weren't fairy tale princesses waiting for rescue. These were real girls, some as young as 11, who faced their worst nightmares while wearing jewels worth more than entire provinces. Their golden cages were still cages. Their silk veils were still chains.